Can you actually buy a home in Switzerland as an expat? With some of the highest property prices in the world and strict rules depending on your residence permit, it can feel almost impossible, and many expats get caught off guard by things like affordability tests, the extra buying costs that vary by canton, or the mortgage rule that work very differently than in other countries. But here's the good news. Owning a home here isn't out of reach if you understand the rules and plan ahead. This video, I'll walk you step by step through what's really possible for expats, the common mistakes to avoid, and the key facts you need before you step into the Swiss property market. Hi, I'm Aysha van der Paer. I'm a cross-border investment specialist in Zurich, Switzerland, with over 20 years in finance and a background that spans New York, Dubai, Amsterdam, Munich, and the UK. On this channel, we dive into the financial questions that matter most to high-earning expats and anyone managing their finances across several countries. And I get messages all the time that some of you didn't realize you didn't even subscribe to the channel. So if you could do me a favor and double check that you are subscribed to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. This is the free thing that you can do if you have an interest in learning more about optimizing your finances as an expat to grow a large retirement portfolio. It also helps making sure I can keep the channel alive and continue to make the time to create these videos. So please do double check if you're subscribed, and thank you so much. The first aspect to discuss is whether foreigners can buy a property in Switzerland. And I don't like this word, foreigner. Doesn't sound very nice, but let me rephrase that to, can non-Swiss citizen buy a property in Switzerland? And that very much depends on your status here in Switzerland, and more specifically, your residence permit here in Switzerland. If you hold a C residence permit, which is the long-term residence permit, you are treated like a Swiss person and you have the same rights to buy whatever real estate you choose as long as you can afford it and the bank is willing to lend to you. So you can buy a primary home or a vacation home or whatever you are looking for. Now, things are a little bit different if you hold a B permit. That's typically the permit you get when you first move into Switzerland that allows you to work and stay here, but it's very much tied to your employment situation. And if you leave Switzerland, you also lose that permit. And for people who hold this B permit, there's again a difference whether you're an EU or EFTA citizen, if you are a non-EU, non-EFTA citizen. If you have a passport from the EU, then everything is quite straightforward as well. You also have the same rights as Swiss residents and C permit holders. You can buy your primary home, you can buy a second home. As long as you have the money, then you don't have any kind of restrictions on what kind of property you can buy. Now, things are a little bit more difficult if you have a B permit and you are from a non-EU country like the US or Australia or Canada or Latin America, because you can buy a home, but you actually have to use it as your primary residence. And you cannot buy a residential property to rent it out. It has to be for your own use, and that property must be located where you live and pay tax. Also, once you have one, you can't purchase another home without a special authorization. And for expats who don't have a valid residence permit here in Switzerland, or for someone living abroad who would like to buy a residential property in Switzerland, it's generally not allowed unless in certain tourist destinations here in Switzerland where you may be allowed to buy a holiday home under certain quotas and restrictions. All these restrictions that apply to non-Swiss and residence permits, they are part of the infamous Lex Scholar legislation, which regulates what non-Swiss residents and to some extent also Swiss residents who are not from the European Union can or cannot do when it comes to residential property. The next aspect is how much of your own money do you need to be able to buy a home in Switzerland? And so essentially, you need about 20% in equity. So you need to come up with 20% in cash to pay for your home. And these 20% have to come at a minimum of 10%, that's really your savings. And for the remaining 10%, you can potentially use your pension assets, the pension assets that you get through your employment. You can withdraw that to help you reach the 20%, but you need at least 10% that is your own savings. Now, there are a few more aspects to it. Specifically, there are more costs when you buy a property, when you buy a home in Switzerland. For example, you have notary fees, which vary by cantons. They vary between 0.1% of the purchase price to 1%, so 0.1% to 1% of the purchase price. And in places like Zurich, Zug, or Schwyz, it's quite low. It's 0.1 to 0.2% approximately. And then in other cantons, it can be more expensive. We have Canton Vaud at 0.2% approximately. And we have Geneva, where it ranges from 0.6%, so 6 times more expensive than Zurich, imagine that, to up to 1%. And in other cantons, like in Fribourg, where I grew up, it's also about 1% of the purchase price. And I remember when I was younger, and I don't remember how I got to learn about these notary fees. And I was at a notary at some point, and I was thinking, this is the most amazing job in the world. They don't do much, if I may say. They basically establish contract. Of course, they do some check and balances. They make everything official and right, but then they get 1% of the purchase price of every transaction. I mean, I thought that was crazy. Now, to be fair, that's the case in Canton Fribourg, where the notary actually cash out that money. Crazy. In other places like Zurich, the notary fees are paid to the canton or to the local government, so it's not being cashed out by the notary person. There is also a fee of 0.1 to 0.3% of the mortgage amounts that applies to create and register the mortgage certificates, which is in German Schuldbrief or in French Cédule hypothécaire. This official document recorded in the land register secures the bank's lien on the property and allows it to enforce the claim if you as the borrower were to default on the loan. Then in addition to notary fees, you also have land registry fees, which vary from 0.1% to 0.5%. They don't apply everywhere. For example, in Canton Basel and Canton Schwyz, there are no land registry fees. In most cantons, a property transfer tax in the amount of no less than 1 to 3% of the property, depending on the size, the amount, the circumstances. And again, that doesn't apply in every canton. In Canton Zurich, Zug and Schwyz, there is no transfer fees. And here you see how things look very different from one canton to the other. Even between Zurich and Geneva, the purchase costs are actually day and night difference. In Geneva, you might go all in all with 4%, and in Zurich, it might be as low as 0.3 or 0.5%. These fees, the notary fee, the land registry fee, and the property transfer tax are usually paid by the buyer, but certain fees in certain cantons are split 50-50, so it really depends on where you are and what are the rules in your canton. There is another fee that comes on top. It's the agent fee, so basically the real estate agent fee that you might use to sell your home. And these fees also vary from 0.5% to 3% or more, depending on the location. And these fees are typically paid by the seller of the property. And I remember when I was working in the real estate sector in Switzerland, I was really amazed, especially being back from New York, how different the fees could be depending on the canton, but also, quite frankly, depending on who you're using as a real estate agent. It can really go from 0.5% to 3%. So if you're looking to sell your home, you might want to get several offers and compare the fees that they would charge you to sell your home. Now let's look at another topic. How do Swiss mortgages differ from other countries? In many countries, like in the US, in the UK, in Germany, most countries actually, when you take a loan for your home, you are required to pay down your mortgage down to zero over 20 to 30 years. Every month you will have a payment, and you will make payments monthly, typically monthly, that include the interest part that you're paying for the loan and also some capital repayment to decrease the mortgage. Now in Switzerland, strangely enough, it doesn't work like that. When you take a mortgage, you are required to pay down the loan until it represents 65% of the value of your home. And once you've reached that, you can actually keep the loan, and most people do. They keep the loan at 65%, or they don't further pay down down the loan, they just keep paying interest forever until they sell the property. And one of the reasons for that, other than the fact that the prices in Switzerland are crazy high, so good luck paying that down to zero. Other than that, up until now, and for the near future, at least, interest payments on a home are tax deductible. So for a lot of people, it kind of makes sense to keep that mortgage because yes, you pay interest, but you can invest in other things instead of paying down your mortgage to zero. And on top of that, you can deduct your interest from your taxes. And usually the way banks structure it is that you have two mortgages or you have one mortgage that is kind of split in two. The first part represents 65% of the value of your home, which is the mortgage that can stay long term. And the second part is the additional part of the mortgage that you are paying back progressively over time, over 15, 20 years, or typically, and usually, you need to reach 65% before your retirement. Banks typically apply this affordability test where they make some kind of fictitious calculation to see if you can afford the mortgage with an interest rate of 5%, even though your interest rate is unlikely to be 5%. Now, let's look a little bit more in detail into this affordability test because this is a big topic. How do you know if you can pass the affordability test? And so they use for this calculation the 5% interest rate as a standard to calculate your mortgage payment, but they typically also add 1% for maintenance and repairs. So they would typically do the calculation with 6%. And they also look at, can you actually afford the amortization, which is actually the part where you pay down the debt down to 65% of the property value over time. Let's say you are looking at an apartment that costs 1 million and you want to borrow 800,000 and you will pay 200,000 in cash for the down payment. So 800,000 times 5% equals 40,000, which is the hypothetical interest payment that you would make every year. Then maintenance and repair cost of 1% represent 10,000, and then they will take the 150,000 that will bring your mortgage down to represent 65% of the home value. Then to take down the mortgage from 80% to 65% over time, this would take 150,000, which divided over 15 years comes to also approximately 10,000 per year. And so adding all of that, 40,000 in hypothetical interest, 10,000 in maintenance and renovations, and 10,000 for amortization and capital repayment brings us to a total of 60,000 per year, which should not represent 33% of your annual gross income. And so this means that to be able to afford this apartment of 1 million, you would need to earn 180,000 per year. Now, these are the official rules. And banks also look at other aspects like, do you have dependents? Do you have other assets? Do you have other debts? To determine how much they are willing to lend to you. And in some circumstances, they will be stricter. And in some circumstances, they will also be a little bit more lenient. And I will tell you, when I bought this house that I'm in now with my husband when he was still alive, we actually had a very good financial situation and the bank was willing to lend us more than 80%. So we actually, I would need to calculate, but it was about 90% that we get in mortgage and we put down 10%. And so the rules are stricter now than they used to. Bear in mind, this was 10 years ago. It really also depends of the market. Banks really hungry to give loans, or are they more cautious? Are there a lot of people who want to buy? What are the home prices? There are a lot of factors that come into play, but by and large, this is how it works. Now let's look at what happens to your Swiss property if you move abroad. And so residential property really falls under this Lex Collar legislation. And if you move out of Switzerland and you lose your residence permit, you are likely to be required to sell your property unless you obtain a specific authorization to keep it. Another aspect that you need to consider is that banks may have other requirements and other conditions if you move abroad and your primary residence and tax residence is no longer Switzerland. And this could also, in certain cases, trigger a loan review, as well reduction of the mortgage or an early repayment, which all in all might mean that you need to sell the property if you can't come up with the money to repay the mortgage to the standards that they have now who don't live in Switzerland and own a residential property here. Now, obviously, if you manage to keep the property while moving abroad, you would still be responsible for maintenance costs, tax costs, and property taxes that are due every year, even though you're no longer a resident in Switzerland. And so if you are an expat and you're planning to move out of Switzerland, whether it's permanently or temporarily, it's very important that you look with your bank, with your canton, and possibly also with a legal advisor so that you can anticipate and prepare yourself with regards to your home. So as you've seen, buying a home in Switzerland as an expat isn't impossible, but it does come with its own unique set of rules, numbers, and conditions, from the type of residence permit you hold to the 20% equity requirement to cantonal fees and affordability test. Every detail matters, and if you're serious about making Switzerland your long-term home, the key is preparation, understanding the financial requirements, knowing how the rules apply for your situation, and getting the right tips and information before signing anything. I hope this video has given you a clearer picture of what's really possible. If you found it helpful, don't forget to like this video and especially subscribe for more expat-focused financial insights. And if you want to dive deeper into building long-term wealth and financial security here in Switzerland, check the link below for resources I've created to guide you step by step. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.